Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, glad to see you, dear friends. So we are going to start our open session of the RJKrug of Manhattan. And this is our scheduled session of RJKrug. We planned it, we scheduled it, our tour to the Metropolitan Museum of Arts. But this specific session is open, so everybody who wanted to join today the RJKrug in Manhattan, they joined us. Just one word, RJKrug. This is the educational program of COJECO RJKrug, and this is the groups of families, 7 families that are friends or they are interested to study Jewish topics for them and for their kids. These groups of families, they meet each month in private homes, and they decide what Jewish subjects they want to study. They create their own curriculum, and each session adults
working on it. Do you need to be talking the same
they
moment?
study the same subjects. So now I'm glad to introduce Nachliel haCohen Selavan. Nachliel is a Jewish educator and Jewish historian. He is expert in museum Jewish education, and he is a director of the Torah Intermedia company of Jewish tours and Jewish museums education, and he is a member of the RJKrug faculty. So I am glad that Nachliel will be our guide today. Now I'll mute everybody, except of Nachliel, of course.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon and regards from Jerusalem, from my last day of quarantine. I'm really excited to be here with this virtual tour. I'm going to go over what I'm going to do with you so you know what to expect. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you right now, which is a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going to be going between the PowerPoint.
Maybe you should be here then.
Hello?
Put it on a computer.
Can we mute a few people? It's really difficult. And I'm going to also be sharing the Google Street View and showing you how to use it so you can explore it yourself. And we're going to be exploring the Egyptian galleries in the Metropolitan Museum. So I'd like to begin to kind of orient ourselves. And I'm going to point you to this picture of Google Earth. And when we want to talk about Egypt, we want to talk about the Exodus, one of the most formative events in Jewish history, which really made us into a nation. And we always talk about the Exodus from Egypt and the oppression in Egypt and freedom. So in order to understand this conceptually, I would like to first introduce the land itself, the most important, the most important characteristic of the land is, of course, the Nile. And in order to understand Egypt and its civilization, the society, and the impact that it had upon our nation and our development as a people in that environment, we need to, of course, visit Egypt and understand Egypt from the Egyptian point of view as much as we can in this short time. So first of all, to orient you onto this image, which is the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley. So just to understand, and we are definitely going to be going into depth into Egypt. But first of all, just to see that the most important thing about Egypt is how narrow it is. It's a long line of green amidst a desert of dryness where there's no life and there's no civilization. In other words, Egypt is a very narrow country which lives along the water, the life, and they plow, they work the fields all along the Nile, and to the desert there is nothing. And that entire long strip is called the Nile.
Take a picture of me at that one.
Anyone for the host to unmute everybody, please?
Please, everybody, please mute yourself.
I think the host is able to do it. Could the host just?
I'm trying to do it. Yeah, I'm trying to do it. Not everybody, but please also mute yourself.
What is this?
I'm sorry, Nachliel, please continue.
I think your son Arachik is not on mute.
Yeah.
And Natalia Kruglaya. Or
If you see, you have, Yigal, you have a line where you have participants. You can manage the participants and see all of them in one window. There you can
Yes,
control
I'm
all of
working
them.
on that. I'm
Okay.
managing participants, but if I'll do mute all, the Nachliel will be muted as well.
No, but then you can unmute me. It's fine.
You can unmute yourself?
No, you can, let me try. If I can't, you'll unmute me after you mute
Okay,
everyone.
I
It's
mute
fine.
all.
Okay. I see that there's still some people who are unmuted, but we're good. Okay. So here we are one more time. So this is Google Earth. This is Egypt to the left, and you can see the Sinai Peninsula, that triangular shape with two gulfs of the Red Sea to its east and to its west. And above the eastern part of the Gulf is the land of Israel. And you can see the Dead Sea a little bit, but you can't really see the Kinneret. This tour is about an hour with some time for Q&A, so it can be between an hour to an hour and 10, 15 minutes, something like that. Okay? Okay, so we're going to delve into Egypt. Now, just a bit of a good quote from the Mishnah is that in every generation, a person must see themselves as if they had left Egypt. And that's kind of what I would like us to do. When I mean us today in the year 2020, to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, we can think that that means to project ourselves into the past and be in Prince of Egypt or in the Ten Commandments, but that's not what I mean. What I think this means is to try to understand what would be in Egypt in modern times. What would be such a power of a civilization which would make it difficult for us to have individual freedom, and how would we struggle with that? So to kind of understand what that meant to be in a society which makes it very difficult for us to be free, and to be able to then extrapolate from that to our lives. So let's go straight into it. I'm going to take you now into the museum, and here we go. So this is Google Earth. This is Google Street View, Google Maps. And the cool thing about it is I'm going to explain to you a little bit of things in case you're not familiar, because it's really helpful to know. On the bottom right of the screen, there's this little figure that when I click him, now all the areas in blue that light up are areas where that little cart with the 360 view camera goes through these areas, and then you can do Street View. So I'm going to take this person and drop him right in front of the Met. And here we are. And you can see on the bottom when this picture was captured. So this one was captured in December 2016. Yep, I remember the Valentin de Boulogne. I remember this exhibit. So this is just a 360 view. This is not yet a Google Street View. Now to get inside the museum, I'm going to go inside the map, and you simply drop him inside. Let's see what happens. Now here's the important thing. Okay, we're inside Egypt. That's good. We're inside Egypt. This is in China. Okay, you do not want to be in China. Hang on. Okay, here we are. So we are now in the entrance of the museum, and I'm going to take you into ancient Egypt. So we're going to walk in the Great Hall. Okay, now this picture was taken in 2010. So some things have changed since then. There's a big
can't hear anything.
into a tomb, which we can't enter, unfortunately, because the car couldn't get in there. And this is an original tomb of an official named Peri-Nebi or Per-Neb, and this was brought in stone by stone into the museum. And everything except this exterior wall, which is modern, everything else here is original. So it's really cool. You can go inside there. But we're going to go, and the first stop we're going to talk about the pharaoh, and we're going to talk about mummies. That's a very good place to start. So let's get started. We're going to go and look at some mummies and the afterlife and the pharaoh. It's going to be a nice journey. This mummy, if I could get a better look at it, is a Roman mummy. Now, why am I telling you this? Because the mummification process and that whole concept of preserving the body for the afterlife was really magical to the people who invaded Egypt. So we're talking about the Greeks and then the Romans. They adopted this culture and they sort of Romanized it, or Hellenized it. So this, what you're looking at right now, is a mummy of a Roman person in Roman style with Roman decorative paints and style. It's really, really cool how they sort of synthesized the two different cultures. This one too is, you can see there's a face there with a wreath on top of it. It's Hellenistic. It's a portrait. And Egyptians did not do portraits. Egyptians just made mass-produced masks and just wrote different names on them. Okay, so moving in. This is the Hall of Facsimile Paintings, which is going to take us to encounter the Pharaoh. And this is all facsimile paintings, which means that these are hand-painted copies, which are 1-to-1, the ratio of paintings that are still underground in tombs in Egypt. So for obvious reasons, you couldn't bring them into the museum, but they were copied for study purposes. And these paintings, therefore, are miscellaneous. They're from all over different tombs. Some of them are in sequence, some are not, and some are changed around a little bit. Like just looking here, this is from 2010. I already recognize some pictures which aren't even here, right? Or some, I know what's here and isn't, and things moved around. So there's always things moving around in here. So there's a lot to see here. I'm going to focus on one picture here, which is cool. I'm going to show it to you in two different places where you see the process of winemaking. And that's going to be important for the Passover, because on Passover we drink wine. And why do we drink wine? Because wine is a drink of royalty, of the upper class. And in ancient Egypt, indeed, in this period of time, wine was only accessible to the upper class or to the kings, because it was very hard to grow grapes in Egypt. And in general, in the world at that time, wine was considered to be a very high level. Beer was the basic drink. So you see people here with a vine, and there's people inside here stepping in a wine press. They're stepping on the grapes, and there's somebody who's collecting the grapes, and there's jugs of wine. So it's just kind of a cool connection to see that this was from some kind of important official's tomb. Let's move up. Okay. So we're going to talk about the Pharaoh now. So let's take a look at him. And here we go. The Pharaoh. Now, to just make this a little bit easier, I'm going to switch to I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint so you can see that that's the same image from the Met. And this is Amenhotep III, who is from what's called the New Kingdom. So we're talking about like the 18th dynasty. And this is an image which really helps us appreciate what was Pharaoh. So we're going to connect Pharaoh and the Nile in just a moment. We've spoken about the Nile. I want to go into Pharaoh a little bit and then connect the two to give this as a framework for the concept of Egyptian monarchy, society, and so on. So the Pharaoh here, you can see him sitting on top of a throne, and behind him is his mother, which is the bloodline, the legitimacy, the heir, like he's from a royal family. So that's his legitimacy. Now, you can see that she looks really, really tiny in comparison. Imagine if he were to stand up, he were towering over her. But don't worry, he wasn't that tall, because look at those people on the very, very bottom. I'm going to enlarge them. These people on the bottom are all slaves, and they're all stereotypical of different nations. They're not portraits. The Greeks did not, the Egyptians did not do portraits. That was the Romans. So each character here was a stereotype of either a Libyan or a Nubian or a Babylonian and so on. And they're all bowing down or praising the Pharaoh. So what we're seeing here is a Pharaoh who is towering above everybody, who is made to look really small, even though obviously they weren't midgets, but it's sending a point. You can think of it as propaganda, as Pharaoh is the most important person in the story, which continues to the right, where there is servants who are giving him some kind of fanning him. But this is just a select piece that was painted from the tomb. There wasn't the rest wasn't put in here. So now look at the Pharaoh himself. You see how he's sitting with his flexed arms, which is a position of power, and he's holding onto the crook and the flail and the ankh. He's holding onto the various staffs of government and rulership and the power of life itself, which is that loop with the cross that he's holding onto. That is ankh, as in Tut Ankh Amun, for example. Ankh means life. And now that you've seen that, you're going to notice that in a lot of different Egyptian pictures. So this is really the pharaoh. He's the biggest, he's the most important, he's the most powerful. He's the leader of Egyptian society, right? So now I'd like to, before we move on to mummies, I want to move into the pharaoh a little bit more so we can understand the pharaoh from an Egyptian perspective. And the Egyptian perspective on the world is a little bit different than the way we think about it. You see, this is how we look at the map of Egypt. We look at the map oriented towards the north, right? Because we have a compass, which is incidentally a Chinese navigation tool and was definitely unknown in the ancient world. And for the Egyptians, the most important thing in the world was, of course, what gave them life, and that is the Nile. So for the Egyptians, this is how they looked at the world, upside down. For the Egyptians, the Nile, which flowed from Central Africa, was the orientation of the world. For them, that was up, and it was topographically higher up. The water came flowing down, pouring into the Mediterranean Sea. So for the ancient Egyptians, the Nile Valley was called Upper Egypt, and the Nile Delta, which is the shape on the very bottom or on the north, is called Lower Egypt. And now historically, the first pharaoh of Egypt, the famous Pharaoh Narmer, is the king who was able to unite Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into one unified kingdom. That is when the dynasties of ancient Egypt begin. We're talking over 4,000 years ago. And each kingdom, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, had a separate crown, which was maintained traditionally even after they were united. So Upper Egypt had this image on, which I now is superimposed over Upper Egypt, which is a conical crown. That's the crown of Upper Egypt. And Lower Egypt has this red crown of Lower Egypt. And when the pharaohs united Upper and Lower Egypt, they created the double crown, the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And that's the crown which the pharaohs would wear to show that they were able to unite both worlds, both kingdoms, even though at times they would wear one or the other, perhaps depending where their seat of government was at the time. But sometimes they did split and then they reunited. So this is very, very important to understand. To understand that for the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh is the one who united the entire land of the Nile. He was the one who controlled it. He had the power over it. And the entire success of the country depended on the pharaoh who makes sure that the Nile functions. And that's kind of what his role was in society. Okay, so now we're going to go back into the museum and explore a little bit more. We're going to go and explore the underworld and mummies. And through that, we're going to get back to Pharaoh. Okay. Now this is a cool part because everything on the left is still in the museum, but everything on the right here is not there anymore. This is an exhibit from a while ago, and things have changed. So this little statue of Osiris, we're going to see Osiris soon as the ruler of the underworld, right? All of this stuff, see if you can even get in here. Yeah, this is not here anymore. This has been removed. Now there's other things going on there. There's the whole Hellenistic display. Now this entire long papyrus, we're gonna zoom into in just a bit. This is a papyrus, meaning it's made from the papyrus plant, of which the Egyptians made what came to be known as paper. And this is called the Book of the Dead. It's a very, very long instruction manual. And this is an instruction manual which is supposed to help the soul of the deceased succeed in going into the afterlife, which they call the underworld or the duat. And in the duat, you would have to go through a series of tests and challenges in order to merit going into the kingdom of Osiris, who's the god of the underworld. And so this is kind of what they were obsessed with, to make sure that the deceased can make it there and live there forever. So we're going to go a little bit in depth into the Book of the Dead, but not before I introduce you to a mummy that I have a family connection with. And if you've been on tour with me, you've heard the story. It's a great story. So this mummy right over here is a Greek Egyptian whose name is Nesmin. And he was mummified in Egyptian tradition, and he's never been opened up. Now, King Tut, who was supposed to be arriving in Boston in June, I don't know what's going on with museums in the world right now. It's all on hold. But either way, King Tut, now in England, was famous because he was discovered with all of the wonderful treasures and riches. And of course, the mummy was opened up. And when the mummy was opened up, it was damaged because it came in contact with oxygen. And the whole purpose of wrapping it up in linen and putting it inside many different layers of sarcophagi is in order to protect it from the air so that it will survive, which is we're going to discuss more in depth. So this one was not open and it was not damaged. and yet we know a lot about it. We know a lot about it because it was put through a scanner, and in the 3D rendering, you're able to digitally remove the layers of linen and then look at the skin and reconstruct the face. You can even digitally remove the skin of the face and look at the bone structure and look for damages and clues and forensics, perhaps to figure out what might be the cause of death. And some pharaohs, we've discovered that they were, let's say, killed in battle, because you can tell the damage that was done to their body in the mummy. Even though they tried to preserve it, you can tell. So you can even tell if they were obese. You can tell, I think Hatshepsut may have had diabetes or been obese, like crazy things that you can find out when you find the mummies. You can tell how well their teeth are preserved, right? And all of this is done by scanning them. Now, my family connection is that this was scanned by a team of radiologists at NYU. One of them is my cousin, Dr. Hoffman. So this is their family mummy, and he sent me some pictures of the x-rays and all that kind of stuff, which today in the museum, there's a plaque of them here on the wall, so you can see all the x-rays and stuff. They didn't have that up yet. So that's cool. And now we're gonna go a little more into depth into mummies. Oh, we're walking through a person. You get a lot of fun glitches in Google Earth, in Google Street View. Okay, this is a big sarcophagus. You can't really stand in front of it. It's just part of the angle. But this sarcophagus is, here we go. It's a sarcophagus for a couple. It's for two, and that's why it's very, very wide. So some royal couple is buried in there. I'm saying royal because they were able to afford having a stone sarcophagus. People who didn't have that kind of money would have had a wood sarcophagus, and if they don't have money at all, well, you don't get to go to the afterlife. That's life. Okay, let's go in and explore some mummies. So this entire room is, we're going through different periods of history in Egypt. We're not really doing the historical, we're doing the conceptual more. But just to point out, this is from what's called the 26th dynasty, which is the same period of time as the Assyrian control over Judea. And let's say the 10 lost tribes, which were destroyed by Assyria, right? It's that period of time. We're talking 2,700 or to 600 years ago. So that's this period of time. Now, I want to show you, first of all, how mummies were made. So you know about the Matrushka dolls, where there's a doll inside a doll inside a doll, right? That's what you're looking at right over here. You're looking at a case on the bottom, which had the mummy inside, then another case on top of it, and finally another case on top of it, which would enclose the whole thing. We've seen them from stone, we've seen them from wood. It really depends what the person was able to afford. Now, all of this was done to preserve the mummy, because the Egyptian belief was that the soul of the deceased can only continue to live if the body is preserved. And so you need to preserve the body in a way that it should last forever. And that way the soul can keep on revisiting it, and then you can come and bring it gifts, and it can taste the food, and it can magically do the things it would do when it was alive, even though it's dead, because the body is preserved. And so they really had many, many beliefs that are associated with this whole reality of life after death. That's that's why most of Egypt is ancient monuments for preserving dead bodies, like the pyramids, because they wanted the bodies to survive. And the pharaohs, of course, must survive because they're like gods. So this is very important to the Egyptians. Now let's look at what was inside these mummies. So first of all, people would bury all their personal belongings. They would bury charms. They would bury cosmetics. They would bury even wigs and so on. We'll see some wigs later on. And some of these were damaged. And there's more books of the dead, all kinds of little statuettes which people would bring when they would pray for the person. So they'd come and bring one and put it there, and go home. And here's an example of the benefits, so to speak, of being mummified in this way. You see on the very left, there's the outer sarcophagus, which is eaten up by fire. It's been burned and damaged. But because there's several layers of protection underneath it, the mummy survived. And there it is. She's laying right down there. She's about 5'2". I've laid down right next to her. You can measure her height. So this small person was put inside another case and another case and another case, which led to it being preserved 2,600 years later. Right? So they really did a good job at preserving the bodies, as long as you don't open them up. And there's a lot more going on here. So for example, somebody even mummified their pet. It's a little bit hard to see it, but there is a dried out gazelle that somebody mummified. It's kind of gross, but you want to keep your pets. Sometimes they would mummify animals for protective purposes, as charms also. Let's look at more. So people wanted to take all their cosmetic jars with them, cosmetic boxes of all different sorts. And of course, robbers knew that there was treasure here. So they would always try to rob them, to rob tombs, which is why so many were looted. Now, right here in this area, I'm going to enlarge this by switching to the slideshow, is the most important part of this entire Book of the Dead, which is called the Judgment of Osiris, and a particular ceremony which is called the Weighing of the Heart. So I'm going to zoom in onto that exact picture from the Met's website, and here it is. Now we're going to go revisit the Judgment of the Heart, but before we do that, I need to introduce you to the most important characters from Egyptian mythology that play a role here. And along the way, as we explore each one, I'm going to highlight a particular point of the Exodus story, the text, which helps us like relate to them. They kind of clarify them. I see we have a question. Yes, I don't have the capability of unmuting, but you go unmute Julia.
I did it.
Oh,
I
here,
just,
you can, okay.
I read this book and I saw like a picture that had to do something similar like this.
Mm-hmm. Was it Egyptian mythology?
I learned about Egyptian in my school.
Okay, because this is a very, very famous thing. There's a lot of mythology books. I even have a comic book of ancient Egypt about this. Some really good stuff. Okay, okay. Is that it? We're good?
No, I just have a question. Because like when I was in this in here like a few months ago,
Mm-hmm.
I know you said like it changed, but like a few things are still here after 10 years.
Oh, yes, yes. That's why
But
all the things that I recognize are because I actually know that they're there. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know. So with the street view, they don't have such good resolution. So I don't really know what some of the things are.
when I was here, this
Okay,
wasn't here.
I'm so sorry. Maybe
It's
we'll ask our questions in the end of presentation.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Thank you
That's fine.
so much. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let's take a look at, I'm going to introduce some of these characters. So just to highlight, these are the three major characters in this image, and we're going to revisit each one of them from right to left: Osiris, Maat, Anubis, and every single one of these, and including this monster who shows up on some of the papyri in different places. On this one, he's out of the picture. I'm going to introduce each one of these and show why they're important to us, and kind of a little highlight which can add to the Passover story or the 10 plagues or so on, where these kind of play a role. So let's begin. The first one is Osiris. Osiris is the god of the underworld. The giveaway is that he's wrapped up like a mummy and he's green. In other words, he's dead, right? His skin is green. Think of like Beetlejuice, you know, and everyone's dead. And so this is Osiris. Osiris, I'm not going into the bigger picture of Egyptian mythology, but Osiris was murdered by his brother and then resurrected by his wife, who was a sorceress. And because he was already killed, so he was resurrected, he becomes the ruler of the underworld. So that's important. And his son, Horus, who runs away, kind of like the best metaphor for this is the Lion King, where Simba runs away after his uncle Scar kills his father, and Scar thinks that Simba is dead, and Simba ends up coming back and taking back Pride Rock. So in the very, very similar story is after Horus runs away, he comes back and fights his uncle Seth and becomes the ruler of the underworld and the upper world. And so Horus is the ruler of both worlds, and the Horus is therefore related to the pharaoh, who's considered to be the god Horus after he dies, because he's the ruler of both lands and Horus is the ruler of both worlds. So they have this duality. It's a fun thing we might be able to get into later. So this is Osiris. And the whole thing is called the Judgment of Osiris, the whole book. Now this guy is the god of the dead, Anubis, not the god of the underworld, but the god of the dead. He is responsible for the transition between life and death. And the reason for that is because the jackal, which is a wild, undomesticated dog, is a dog which is frequently found in the outskirts of the city where the cemeteries are and around death, or they're used as battle dogs and war dogs. And so for the ancient Egyptians, when they want to give a face, a character to the power that's responsible for death, they call it Anubis. And this is fan art, of course, but Anubis is very, very important. And one thing I'm going to add, which has to do with the 10 plagues, there is one of the 10 plagues, which of course has to do with death. And that is the 10th plague, which is called the death of the firstborn. And it's a very interesting thing that happens is that when the Egyptians are warned that the firstborn of every house in Egypt is going to die, they are told that not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that God makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And so you kind of wonder, we're sitting here in 2020 and we're looking at this verse and we can kind of say, okay, so there's this miracle and all of the Egyptian firstborns die, but the Jews don't. And so I guess they'll know, that God is going to carry out what he said he's going to do. But what's it got to do with dogs not snarling at anybody? But when you're living in ancient Egypt, the assumption is that when there is death, Anubis is present. And the way you will feel Anubis is present is dogs are going to howl and make noise. But if there's death everywhere and the dogs are going to remain completely silent, it's really unnatural. It's supernatural. And that is sort of, in terms of Egyptian mythology, that's telling the Egyptians, Anubis is not involved in this. Your perception of the world is wrong. And so I like to call the 10 plagues the 10-step therapy process program for the Egyptians to kind of gradually wean them from the way they look at the world. And you can sort of look at it like that. I'm making a very long story short, but I'm going to give a few more examples. So now we have Maat, who's the goddess of balance and cosmic order. Now she is very important because the pharaoh's role in the world, according to the Egyptians, was to be responsible for balance and cosmic order. They need to maintain order in the world. Egypt was basically the world for them, and order meant that the Nile will flow and give life. And so in order to maintain the life power of Egypt, you need to support the pharaoh who is controlling it. And you can kind of imagine how that locks you in to being mentally subjugated to the pharaoh who is responsible for your life. And so you're always in this dependency cycle. Now let's analyze Maat for a bit. So Maat's hieroglyph, her symbol, her icon is the ostrich's feather. And it's a very big feather, and it's a feather which is balanced on its tip. And balancing a feather on the tip, an ostrich feather, is very, very difficult to do. In fact, it's pretty much impossible unless you're in a total vacuum. And the reason this is her symbol is because she represents order and balance. And this is perfect balance, to have an ostrich's feather balanced on the tip. And so Maat is the representation of justice and order. And it's what you're going to, if you want to see if somebody's heart is just, you're going to weigh them against the feather of Maat. So that's a very important thing. And one before we get back, is we have this monster called Ammut the Devourer, who you see here looks like the pet of Anubis. Now, this is an Egyptian monster, which is a conglomerate. It's a mixture of 3 of the biggest human-killing animals in Egypt. You have the crocodile, you see the face. You have the lion, you can see the mane and the paws, and also the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, a hippo. And hippos are big, don't mistake hippos as being cute animals. Hippos are very, very dangerous, especially if you get near the mother's children. A hippo runs faster than a person and they can snap a person in half with one bite. So they're very, very dangerous animals that live in close proximity to humans, and humans are afraid of them, right? Because they live in the Nile. And so this monster is going to play a very important role in the Book of the Dead. Now, just one more thing, which is kind of a tidbit, is the plague of wild animals, which is the 4th of the 10 plagues. It's called Arov. And I'm pointing out the Hebrew here because that might help understand what it means. So what is this Arov thing? So there's many ways to understand it. It can just mean a whole bunch of wild animals just gather and just roam through the town. I mean, I think we kind of feel like some countries in the world now are having the wildlife reclaiming the streets, right? So just imagine like really scary animals. But the Arov, I'm quoting here Rashi, the medieval commentator, who says that this means all kinds of wild beasts, serpents and scorpions, in a mixture of noxious creatures. Now, the word mixture, irvuvia, Arov, is really the source of the word for wild animals, a mixture. So my friend, Dr. Rafi Zeram, suggested that maybe this could be, we don't really know for sure, but maybe that the concept of Arov is supposed to be this boogie monster of the Egyptian horror movies. You know, it's their Ammut, the devourer, this monster. So we're going to see how he plays a role, but it's kind of a cute thing, like, because who knows, right? Okay, so let's go back into the Book of the Dead. Now you know all the important characters. You know Anubis right there in the middle. You see Osiris sitting down. And on the scale, you have on the left-hand side, you have the heart of this woman, who you see this woman a lot because this is her Book of the Dead. This is to tell her what to do, right? And on the right-hand side of the scale is Maat. sitting there with her little feather on her head and holding the Ankh, the symbol of life, in her hands. So if you want to tell if a person is just, the person is, first of all, going to have to stand up and make a proclamation. I didn't steal, I didn't murder, and they're in front of Osiris. And there's Anubis, of course, is responsible for this judgment, because Anubis has to do with life and death, right? And now when you want to measure if somebody was a righteous person, you're going to measure them against the scale of justice, which is of course Maat. Now, one more thing here.
I can't hear you.
You muted yourself.
I'm sorry, I had to cough and I unmuted myself. Okay, you all hear me? Okay. Now, back to the judgment of Osiris. So we have the weighing of the heart here, right? There's Anubis who's responsible for life and death, and therefore he's weighing the heart, and he's weighing it against the scale of justice, which is Maat, as we know. Now, the important thing is that the heaviness of the heart means evil. That's what it means in the scale, because if your heart is too heavy against the scale of justice, that means you're an evildoer. And we find that the language of heavy heart is synonymous with evil in the text. When Moses, for example, is told that Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened, the word for hardened is sometimes used as made heavy, as kaved, as we shall see. Now, before we get to that, I just want to point out one thing. I call this the 10 plagues, the 10-step therapy session, because in a sense, the Pharaoh's belief is that the Pharaoh is just and he's maintaining cosmic order and balance. And therefore, the concept of coming to the Pharaoh and saying, you are supposed to let the Hebrews go, Tim, like, what do you mean? You want me to just like destroy the economy by letting all of the slave population leave? Who are you to tell you what to do? Now, you can bully him out of taking us out, but that's not going to help us feeling free, because we only feel free when we believe that we are free and not somebody else pulls us out by force, right? And so there needs to be a process of recognition where the Pharaoh himself recognizes that this is a morally unjust thing. It's morally wrong to subjugate us. And that indeed happens at plague number 7 in any event, where he comes to Moses and Aaron and he says to them, I stand guilty at this time. The Lord is right and me and my people are evildoers. And the quote here is always, all these quotes are from Exodus unless it says otherwise. And so the point is here that there is something that's happening in this process of the plagues, in the way it's addressing the Egyptian beliefs and their mythology, that's gradually helping the Pharaoh recognize that there is actually a moral conversation going on here, and he is doing something wrong, which really took a tremendous amount of effort and growth on his part, and we need to appreciate that. Okay. And finally, this is another Book of the Dead. The reason I'm showing you this one is because you can also see the monster Ammut on the bottom right, except here instead of a lion, it looks like a cheetah or a leopard or something. But it's the same story, and many of them are the same. And one last thing, as I mentioned, the verse that I put here on the top is that Pharaoh's heart was made heavy, because heaviness in the lingo of ancient Egypt means evil. So it's kind of a cool thing that we have the Book of the Dead to kind of help us glimpse into the way people use this language back then. Okay, now we're going to go back into the museum. So we've seen the Book of the Dead, we've seen a lot of mummies, and now I'm going to take you to see one thing from Ramses the Great. We'll talk about him for a moment, and then we're going to go to the Temple of Dendur. All right, this over here, I'm going to look up so you can see it. This is a very tall stela of Ramses the Great. Now, a word about Ramses the Great and then about this particular architecture. There is a discussion about the Exodus, the famous academic question, did it happen, did it not happen, do we have proof for it, when did it happen? I'm not going into too much depth, I just want to point out one important thing, is that most academic opinions would say that the Exodus would have taken place in the time of Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty. And this is for several different reasons. However, there are other opinions that put it 200 years earlier in the 18th dynasty in the reign of Amenhotep, which is the one we just saw earlier when we examined the pharaoh. So one of those, there were several Amenhoteps. It could be in that neighborhood. There's many reasons for this discussion. There's new data which just came out now which has carbon-14 analysis, which has really changed Egyptian chronology by about 200 years. It's really hot off the press. I can't talk about it yet. I need to read it thoroughly. But this is constantly in conversation. So it's not absolute that it's Ramses the Great. There are reasons to say yes. There are reasons to say no. And there's some pretty significant reasons to say no as well. In any event, you can see the pharaoh standing here, and he's wearing the conical hat of Upper Egypt. And what's really cool is these deep, deep carvings. You can see the deep shadow because of the depth of this carving. And the reason for this is because the Egyptian pharaohs would usually reuse the monuments of the previous pharaohs, either because they wanted to erase their name or because they didn't want to make something new, or because, whatever the reason was, Ramses the Great said, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. And so he carved so deep into the granite that it just wasn't worth the trouble of carving on top of it, and this lasted. That's a really cool story. Now we're going to go and take a look at the Temple of Dendur. We're going to tell a little story there. To watch your eyes, it's going to change. Here we go. The Temple of Dendur, you'll never see it so clear unless you're at this time of the day. It's like 7, I don't know what time in the morning they did this. But this is recent, 2020. Oh, wow. Okay. No, this can't be 2020 because the crocodile is missing. Now, the Temple of Dendur is here on the Nile. We've spoken about the Nile, so this is simulating where the Nile was when this was in Dendur. Now, Dendur is in the very south of Egypt on the border with Sudan. It's by Aswan. And that's where in the 1960s, 60 years ago, the Egyptian government built the Aswan Dam, which was supposed to help it maximize the usage of the flow of the Nile to increase its productivity, which it did, but it came at the cost of damaging the wildlife and the coasts all the way to the coast of Israel. But that's a longer story. Do I have any comments here? I don't know what the question is. It's a girl or a boy. How do you know if it's a girl or a boy? I don't know if what's a girl or a boy. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this just to tell a brief story about this because it's a really fascinating story, and then we're going to move along. So the Temple of Dendur, if you're in the museum, you can see all of these plaques here tell you the story of the Temple of Dendur and how it was brought to the United States. The major story was that when they built the Aswan Dam in the south, remember that the water in Egypt is flowing from the south towards the north. And so everything below the dam is rising, all the water is rising, and these monuments, this is one of them, was flooded by water and needed to be rescued. And so it was a joint operation of UNESCO, which America was involved in, to rescue these monuments from ancient Egypt. And as an appreciation for the United States, it was given as a gift. It was given as a gift to the United States, and it was put in the Met. The Torah, I think the Torah has between 20 to 30 minutes left, probably somewhere, something like that. Okay. Now, the Temple of Dendur, one fun story about this. The Temple of Dendur was built in honor of the Roman Emperor Augustus, which means that it's not really built for a pharaoh. It's not really built for an Egyptian god. It's really built for the pharaoh who, this picture here, which was also the cover on Facebook of this event, shows you Emperor Augustus standing here next to some Egyptian gods, but Emperor Augustus looks like a pharaoh. And that's because this is propaganda. You want the Egyptians to kind of accept him as one of their own. Now, the fun thing about the Temple of Dendur, you see that there's these windows here. I'm sure you've all, or most of you have been there. It's built into Central Park, but you really can't get in there from Central Park. And this is really a fun story because part of the agreement of the Egyptian government was that it would be put inside it would be in a public space, right? It would be like in a park. And so it was, but it was surrounded by a glass window. So you can kind of imagine that there's some Jewish Talmudic mind behind there saying it is inside in a public place, but you can't get in there. And so we can still have it. It's kind of like a fun story. Okay. So now I'm going to take you to, we have one last major stop with a few fun things along the way. So just take one last look at this. Temple of Dendur. Can't wait to see you in real life. Okay, let's go back in here. Okay. There's a lot to see here. There's a little game here. I'm not gonna, I don't want to take too much of your time. There's so many little details here. like Egyptian baskets, made from reeds. You can tell the story of Moses, the baby boy in the basket, and you can stand here and take pictures. People do that. These baskets are not here anymore, by the way. This is from 10 years ago. Some of this stuff, this is still here. Some of the stuff is still here, but the baskets aren't there anymore. This one is. Now we're going to go through Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut, I'm sure you've heard the name because she is a queen pharaoh. She was a pharaoh who called herself a pharaoh, a king, because she wanted to be appreciated. And she didn't want people to say like, no, she's just a regent. She's just ruling until her nephew is old enough because, the king died. So she's like, no, I'm going to be the king. Now, a few things about Hatshepsut. Crown of Lower Egypt, crown of Upper Egypt, and finally, on the top here, we have the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So that means she was a very powerful pharaoh. And one fun thing about her is that you notice that she has a beard. Now, she doesn't really have a beard, but neither did many of the pharaohs. The beard is actually strapped on, and if you look up close at the granite statue, you can even see a little bit of light here. There's a strap on the side. It was basically strapped on ceremoniously because the gods had beards. The pharaoh is like a god, so they wore these beards ceremoniously. But they generally shaved all of their hair because of lice and the heat, and so they would just wear these wigs ceremoniously and then take them off. Okay, now we're almost there. A lot of fun small things to see. The jewelry here is a little bit harder to see in this resolution. Okay. And here I wanted you to see just the size of this gateway, which is pretty small in comparison with some of the bigger ones, which are still in Egypt, like in Karnak. But it shows you the massive building of Egypt, which is really built to make the regular person seem small and insignificant and to glorify the pharaoh. That's really, really important because the whole massive industry of ancient Egypt was to glorify the pharaoh, who's like a god who rules Upper and Lower Egypt, rules the Nile and controls the world, and everybody serves the pharaoh. And it's important to recognize that because in terms of Egyptian hierarchy, the fact that you have a cycle in which if you're a farmer, and we're going to talk about farming, that's our next step, our next stop. If you're a farmer and you're successful and you have a lot of produce because the Nile was successful, who takes the credit? The pharaoh takes the credit because you have to bless the pharaoh who's then going to give you the gift of the Nile being flowing. And so he takes all the credit for what you produce. And that's very important because that means that the concept of slave mentality is part and parcel of Egyptian society because you're always subjugated to the pharaoh who is basically controlling your life. And this has been going on for thousands of years. It's deeply rooted. So this massive statue kind of gives you a sense of Egypt's magnitude and its colossal building, which is intended to make you feel small. Okay, now here's where we might have, here we are. We just jumped through the wall and here we are in our last stop. So this room, and I'm gonna move to the slideshows in just a moment. This room is a fantastic discovery. Here we go. You can see it better from here. So in 100 years ago, in a place called the Valley of the Kings in Thebes, where there's many different kings who are buried there, a famous site for tomb loot robbers because there's going to be a lot of treasure there, a lot of gold and jewelries and stone and precious gemstones, right? So they're all going to get robbed. Now, 100 years ago, when the Met was excavating here, in the tomb of they found a tomb which was empty, but when they were kind of cleaning out there to make a schematic of the shape of the floor, they discovered a hidden door. And in the hidden door, there's a picture of the hidden door somewhere here. Yeah, you can't see it from here. They found all of these tiny models, original, colorful, painted wooden models from 4,000 years ago, from the time of the ancient pyramids, the old pyramids. This is really cool. And I'm going to show them to you up close, and then we're going to discuss our last topic. You can kind of see this is showing you a black and white photo from 100 years ago of what the cave looked like when they found it, except that there was a bit of a ceiling collapse, so some of the stuff was damaged, but it was restored. All of these little boxes, all over here, and these boats and all the linens and jewelry. And so now I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to switch my screen one last time so you can see these are the models. And this is all original paint, original wood. Even the linens that the servants on the boat are wearing, those dresses are original. You can see some of it's eaten up, damaged, but this was underground for 4,000 years in the arid, humid, air and the heat of Egypt in such unique conditions that it survived. And this is what Egypt wanted to do. They wanted to make sure that everything survives. So let's take a look at these inside and discuss a few important things. So you see the Egyptians on the left, they have cows. Egyptians loved eating cow meat. They ate meat. That's one of the animals that they domesticated. In the middle, you have bread and beer production, which is what you make from grain, what Egypt was very good at doing, and also boats, which they love flowing along the Nile. But now let's look a little bit in depth into some of the story, the bread and the Nile. So you see these people, they're processing grain. There's a person there on his knees who is making different shapes of bread. His hands are white with flour. There's somebody there with a rolling bread. There's people who are crushing grain there. So, yeah, a question? Okay. So people are producing bread. Now, there's one story in which we left Egypt, right? And the Israelites, the Hebrews, started complaining because we left Egypt and we're in the desert and we don't really know how we're going to survive. We need a lot of logistical solutions. You know, we need water, we need food. So they start complaining and they say, listen, if we had only died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, things would have been good because we were slaves there, but we had flesh pots. We had a lot of meat to eat. We had lots of bread to eat. And now we're here in the desert. We don't know what's going to happen. And we're just all going to die and everybody panics, right? So that kind of thing, you know, it's like, grow up. Come on, guys, we're going to take care of you. But okay, so that concept of about meat and bread. Now I want to take it a step further when we complain. Okay, so here's another part of the model. It's zoomed in from the Met's website so you can really get a close-up look. The women on the left are grinding grains with a grindstone, which is what you do every single day because in the ancient world, you don't have refrigerators, right? You need to make everything fresh every single day. And it's a very laborious exercise to basically to make bread, to keep the household, I mean, was difficult stuff, right? So there's three things going on here. The women on the left are grinding, and that's where the expression, the daily grind, comes from. The daily grind, because every single day you need to grind what you're going to eat that day. Then there's a person there making dough, and it really looks fresh. You see that there's powder on the dough and in his hands, and there's a person to the right who's on the oven because they're gonna need to bake it. Now, here's something really important about ancient Egypt. The Egyptians invented bread. Bread is an invention of Egypt. And that's very important because the reason that Egypt invented bread, or rather the background for that, is that Egypt is a society which is settled around the Nile. They don't travel. Every other culture, or many of the other cultures, are nomadic. They simply travel. And when you're traveling, like our forefathers, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, they were all nomadic. They had herds. They had to move along the line to follow the weather and to have grazing land. Like they were moving all the time. When you're on the move, first of all, you definitely don't have an oven, right? You have pita bread. You basically have like matzah today isn't really what we ate. It was more like pita bread, like a very soft matzah, which like Yemenites eat that. And that's the typical food for people who are nomadic. The society of Egypt allowed people to sit down and let things rise, and therefore they invented bread. And because of the Nile, which had such surplus, they were able to produce so much grain. Grain, if you want to measure Egypt's GDP, you'd measure it in grain. Grain was the economic power of ancient Egypt, which really gave it a tremendous amount of power, and why many of the empires up to Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to control Egypt, because the Nile and the production really allow you to produce a lot of grain and to feed an empire, right? So Egypt's power was in its grain. Okay, now we have a very fascinating story. This is in the book of Numbers, when the Hebrews again are complaining. And this time they're saying, listen, if only we could have meat. I mean, we remember the fish that we used to eat for free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. And here we're just going to die, right? We have this manna, okay, fine. I'm not going into the manna. But look at the word free, which I highlighted at the end of the second line. We were slaves in Egypt, and we ate the food for free. Think about that for a moment. God forbid, if we were to imagine what it would be like to be in Auschwitz, where you're given a free crummy piece of bread and some soup every day, if you're lucky, for free. But you don't have a life, right? Your life is completely dominated by somebody else, and the food is free. We were slaves in Egypt. How could you possibly consider the food in Egypt to be free, right? Unless there is something very important here, because the word free doesn't really mean freedom. It means free of responsibility. It means I don't have to think about anything that I do. It's all dictated to me. I'm told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, where to do it. I don't have to think about it. That is called slave mentality. Slave mentality means I want everything to be taken care of for me. I don't want to think for myself. And freedom is about thinking for ourselves. And once we left Egypt, we need to start figuring out what we're going to do with ourselves instead of being told what to do. And we're basically looking at these developmental stages of, you can even call it childhood and then adolescence of a nation trying to figure out how to be free. So that's kind of something that we see. And finally, one last thing is the commandment of Pesach, which is very unique, is to abstain from eating leavened bread and basically bread and beer, right? Things that rise and ferment. And instead, for 7 days of Passover, we need to eat unleavened bread, what we call matzah. Now, you can think about that and philosophize about that from here until whenever, but when you look at the context of ancient Egypt, it makes a lot more sense. It was intuitive to the people at the time. Think about it. The basic food of Egypt was bread and beer. In fact, we know that the people, the farmers, the Egyptians who built the Great Pyramids in Giza were paid for their wages with bread and beer. That was basic wages in the past, bread and beer, right? And so when you have bread and beer, which are the characteristics of Egyptian food, Egypt invented bread, and beer are those things that which rise and are the staple foods of Egypt, it's the complete opposite of matzah, because matzah, again, it's nomadic food. And Egypt is a country which settles and everything kind of rises. And matzah is to remember our roots as people who are nomads, people who travel. It's kind of like the Jewish experience throughout history. We've always been traveling and adapting and moving, and that's how we kind of stay alive, right? And so the idea of matzah is the contrast with Egypt. Egypt's bread basically carries with it all of that stuff which we can call slave mentality of dependence on the Nile, dependence on the Pharaoh. All of that, we need to move away from that when we want to talk about freedom. We need to be in our minds in a state of mind of movement. And here's one last thing I'm going to say before we wrap up, and then we'll open up the floor for questions, is H.E. Jacobs in a book called 6,000 Years of Bread. It's Holy and Unholy History. 6,000 Years of Bread is a book about the history of bread by a World War II American baker. I mean, I think he was German, but he was in the American Army. And he wrote the first 2 chapters of his book. The first chapter is about Egypt and the invention of bread. And the second chapter of his book is about the Jewish calendar surrounding, because the first month in the Jewish calendar is actually this month of Passover, because it's when we were born as a nation and it's the spring. And so he puts the two together as the most important landmarks, milestones that is, in the history of bread. So it's really fascinating. Oh, okay. I'm going to try to behave. So this one last thing from Jacob's book, 6,000 Years of Bread, is that he points out that the concept of leavened bread, of unleavened bread, is freedom and movement, because it's always you're on the move, your movement, and that's freedom and that's life, whereas Egypt's food is like decadence and its slave mentality. And he points out that in ancient Egypt, the concept of individual freedom was non-existent. It was all governed by the Pharaoh. So that was kind of to wrap up. I just want to show one last thing. Egyptians used barley and wheat and yeast. That is different from other cultures. Is it correct? I don't remember all the details, but I think the yeast, the starter, was a crucial ingredient in the making of bread, which they perfected in Egypt. I remember reading about it in Jacob's book. It's been a while, so I have to review it. But yeast is very important because that's what lets it rise. If you're a nomad, you don't want your bread to rise because that will spoil it. So it definitely is unique to Egypt in the beginning. I'm not sure where else yeast was used, but I know that it was unique to Egypt in the beginning because it gives you the properties, okay? And finally, one last thing. This is a very famous image from Karnak. This is monuments of Ramses the Great. And you can see, if you look at the very bottom, at that small little entrance, you can see people. This is extremely large, and it makes you feel small. And you can see the crowns of the double crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt on the head of the pharaoh. And the point of all of this is to make us all feel small. Egypt is the land of Mitzarim, actually in Hebrew means constriction. It's like the land which constrains you. And what we saw is that the very way that the society is built, with the Pharaoh on top of everyone, ruling the Nile, and the success of the Nile being attributed to the Pharaoh, and the way that their food and everything is dependent on it, that's pretty much what's called slave mentality. And leaving this is part of what created our national struggle for freedom, which really made such an impact because we are still doing that today. We're constantly trying to explore and redefine and be free in a world which is constantly trying to tell us what we need to be and what we need to do. And so that's